Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode and session of the Chris and Arash Show. And welcome, Chris, my co-host, co-creator here.
Thank you, Arash, and welcome to you. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good.
Great. So our topic is creativity. Let's creatively dive into it.
Yes. Um, I was going to start with what is creativity,
Very
but
good.
was very
Good
kind
start.
of almost overwhelmed by that question. Um,
Maybe
I
we should start with what is it not?
okay. Yeah, I mean, I think when Einstein talked about how imagination is more important than knowledge,
Yeah.
that to me points towards what creativity is, where we can sort of amass skills, we can amass knowledge, information can be stored in our brains, how to do things. But then there's some kind of synthesis that happens, some kind of magic happens. And then we're starting to make connections that we didn't see before. Or maybe the connection just kind of happen on their own to some extent. And
I
that's what I
really
would
like
call
that.
that creativity.
That definition, and it's coming from a scientist who says this is more important. We would expect the scientist to say it's knowledge, facts, but no.
Right.
And one of the greatest scientists that ever lived. So yeah, I fully agree with that. And I think it's the creative aspect of it is to create something. And so it could be something completely new, or again, it could build on previous things, like you're saying, analysis, but also synthesis of coming up with a new perspective. And to me, it's a huge skill. It's a really important skill to have
Yeah.
and to develop.
Yeah, I feel it's always that sense of creativity being associated often with artistic expression, with the
Mhm,
arts.
mhm,
But I think more and more it's becoming an understood thing that we don't move forward in any field or discipline without that. Like whatever knowledge workers, IT, whatever it is, at some point we're just going to we'll be stuck in our own little, whatever we're doing now, but without those sort of creative leaps forward, there is no growth or development.
Yeah,
So
and there's
creativity
two
is
parts
everywhere.
to it. Absolutely. And there's two parts to it. Like there's thinking outside of the box, which is people talk about it, but they actually don't do it,
Yeah.
especially when they say they're thinking outside the box. I think they just fall right in it. But it's also like the employers supposedly are looking for, but then they say, no, here are the rules. Forget about that. You can't come up with your own rules. These are established. But there's also the element of problem solving and where you need to be creative to solve it. And we often think it's just like logic and based on information. Yes. But what do we do with it? And we've seen it with the pandemic where people had to be creative to come up with a vaccine that would work. And it's not just following those rules and this is how we do it and let's continue going that path. It's coming up with a new one. And that is to me, again, creativity.
That's right. And I think and that's sort of the idea on one hand that, thinking outside the box, outside of the usual constraints, but in the same time, sometimes having new constraints will actually force us to see things in a new way. You know what I mean? Like, so
Mhm.
even with COVID, it's like, well, we don't have time to do all of the usual, processes. Is there another way? Yep. Like if the whole world just gets together, world scientists, and we were able to put together vaccines and things like that. So sometimes it's really it's almost like having a smaller box made us
Mhm.
made us more creative,
Mhm.
um, and realized that some of the old rules didn't really apply, or we didn't really have to follow them. So yeah,
Mhm. So
I think yeah, and I think that we do need, to me, creativity is something that does happen out of sort of a certain need, or as opposed to kind of pure freedom. Like
mhm.
when Leonard Cohen used to talk about how he still liked to have rhyming, rhymes in his work because that would just impose that certain amount of constraint that would make him more creative.
Mhm.
So it's
Mhm.
kind of interesting that we sort of do need limits to push against. or else it's just there's nothing there to do. It's just like
Exactly. Yeah. But also to have the flexibility that goes with it and say, okay, let's break some of those rules. And we see it talking about creative arts. We see it in painting where we say, let's come up with a completely new style, which then becomes formalized and established and then becomes again something that is a rule, and then you break that rule again. So it's kind of that constant like feedback of like, okay, we're creating something new, it becomes part of the routine, and then we go again. Synthesis, as you're saying, it's again bringing it all together. I think that's
yeah,
hugely important. Yeah.
absolutely. And as I was sort of preparing for this, one of the interesting little experiments that kept coming up in various places was Frank Barron did an experiment because he's a big creativity researcher, where there was a group of people who were sort of generally understood to be creative, just
Mhm,
whatever,
mhm,
and then others who were sort of just regular folks. And he created these cards, and some of the cards had very chaotic images on them, and the others had very orderly designs. And the people who we think of as creative favored the chaotic images over the
makes
order,
sense.
and
Mhm,
and the others were very much opposed to the chaos. And so out of that, sort of this idea that creativity in part is embracing uncertainty, and that
mhm.
there is no creativity without challenging assumptions, without sort of saying, okay, I don't know, let's jump into the gray zone.
I
um
find that fascinating because wisdom is also related to uncertainty and dealing with uncertainty. So we can see a combination of like a creative wisdom, basically, of having that confidence and that we can come up with things, right? That we have ideas to deal with the situation. And so it's also our different brain states too. It's quite interesting as I was looking at it. So we have the beta brainwave, which is our regular everyday logical thinking, but then it's the deeper ones that lead to creative flashes of inspiration and so on, which is theta, which is related to mindfulness, and then we have also delta, of course, that is then deep getting into your unconscious, basically, or deep sleep. But it's quite fascinating that while we are in this constant like thinking logically about things and like being alert in the beta wave, we are missing out on other perspectives and on creativity, whereas we have where we're more relaxed, which is the alpha brainwave, where we can see things perhaps also a bit more in a different way, maybe more with more compassion, with more empathy. And so I think that's quite interesting how our brains are work. But when you're in one state, you basically, especially in our regular state, a beta, you're basically blocking creativity in
mhm.
many ways.
Right, for just to be able to kind of have that work a day. I've got 9 things on my to-do
Mhm,
list.
mhm,
I
mhm.
need to go pick up my dry cleaning. That's sort of
Yeah,
very outcome based, very logical, and kind of dull state of mind
absolutely,
just to get
absolutely. Yeah.
just get shit done, basically. Yeah, I'm glad that you got us on the topic of sort of levels of consciousness
Mhm,
related to creativity, because to me that's sort of one of the most interesting parts of this. And you know, one of the I love this. I'm just going to throw a couple of quotes here,
mhm.
um, which is that where is it? This is Dave Chappelle talking to Jerry Seinfeld and comedians, getting coffee in cars, talked
Oh
about
yeah,
his
yeah.
creative
Great
process.
show.
And
Yeah.
he was saying that basically sometimes he wakes up in the morning, he's like, I'm going to write a joke, I'm going to be super funny. And it doesn't happen. And it's
Mhm,
because he's like, because I'm not, he said that he's not in the driver's seat. It's like the idea is in the driver's seat. So sometimes he said, maybe I'm in the passenger seat, maybe I'm in the trunk,
mhm.
but
I like the trunk.
if I just get into the car myself and go, I'm driving today, I'm making, no one else is in the car, nothing else is
Mhm,
happening. And
mhm,
so what I thought that was so interesting, because it was sort of suggests a kind of somewhat of a passive or receptive state, for
mhm,
creativity, that it's something that
mhm.
we are a kind of beacon or something that's picking up the signals, as opposed to willfully pushing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'm gonna be super creative, and I think that when we get into spirituality, which we've dealt with before on this podcast, there is that level of stillness. Eckhart Tolle talks about this, where stillness is really where creativity comes from. And I really believe that. And so I think, but what we're talking about there are those brainwave
Hmm.
or brainwaves that you
Hmm.
mentioned.
Yeah, and if we go
Level of
back,
stillness.
absolutely, if you go back in time, I mean, we have the muse, and so inspiration was something that you would be inspired, that would come to you from outside, and it's that kind of lack of control, if you like, and that's what Dave Chappelle is also referring to. It's like the ideas come to you. You're not like actively creating them. You will work on them, of course, but it's like a flash of inspiration, and we see it with Einstein, who had his greatest moments when he was not working, when he was not in that brain wave, where he's taking the elevator and it's like, oh wait, I got this. Or you're taking the train and you say, oh look, this is what's happening when you look outside of your window. So it's that kind of like relaxation of the body and probably also of the mind, and taking things slowly, and then things come to you.
Right. And there's probably, I mean, we not probably, but there must be some dynamic there where there is some activity and then that relaxation. I think, like where I was just reading again about somebody who was, I think, again, a scientist who would sort of work in terms of gathering data and doing all of that, but at some point would sort of send a message to their unconscious and say, here's the question, and I'm going to keep reading, but I'm going to sort of let that unconscious, and then a few months later, the answer kind of comes, Crick and Watson working on the double helix for how the DNA is structured. The double helix came as a dream, right? Like that, the
Mm-hmm.
image for, but it wasn't just out of nowhere. They had been working on it for a very long time, trying to imagine what it might be, and then the unconscious sort of does this part, and they're able to sort of access that level of consciousness. The other part to me that I think is really interesting is just how close the word creativity and reactivity is. Like just a couple, one letter away from me, and but they're kind of, to me, diametrically opposed. I think that I know for myself, I've always struggled with creativity, like maybe a lot of people who do anything creative. It's like you do a few things that are like, oh cool, like I did something that I was quite pleased with, and then you spend like the rest of your life trying to get back there. You're like, wait a minute, why did it worked once or twice, why can't I just access that anytime? And I realized one of the things that I sort of strayed from the path was I became very intentional, willful, and reactive about creativity, where it was very much like with David Chappelle's metaphor, like I was just getting in the car, like
Mm-hmm.
pushing on the accelerator, let's go, and it just wasn't going anywhere. And I realized that reactivity is going to kill it every time. Like when you're
Mm-hmm.
just merely like sort of reacting to what's around you, as opposed to allowing yourself to be open and experience what's around you, and then from that sort of creativity would arise, but it's not going to be you who's going to be pushing that.
It reminds me a bit of writer's block, where we're blocking that path to creativity. I want to go back to what you were saying earlier too, with like the quote, "Nothing comes out of nothing." Parmenides, as well as, of course, Shakespeare and King Lear. Again, misquoting Shakespeare here, but and I find that quite fascinating, because that's exactly what you're alluding to. But we can push it in a kind of uncomfortable, for some, uncomfortable direction of the creator and of somebody creating something. So that there's like the first mover, if we go back to the existence here of God, of a spiritual entity. But I find that also interesting, whether we believe in that or not, that this is the act of creation is emulating it, where we're trying to bring something out of nothing, so to speak. Of course, it's not. It's based on our previous experiences and so on. But it is that process, and that's why it's so fascinating for us to come up with things, because we are, in a way, and scientists do the same thing. We are playing God for a little
Mm,
bit of time.
that's right. Yeah, I mean, and I think that's the really sort of exciting part of it, is that we are capable of these leaps, that where did that come from?
Mhm.
And that's really great. And I think when we talk about those accessing those leaps and accessing those levels of consciousness and all of that, one of the things we need to talk about are flow states.
Mhm.
Like being able to fall into that place where things become effortless, and it's almost like you're not the one who's doing it. You're just sort of
Mhm.
in the flow, and it's just happening, and ideas are coming, and it's just sort of enough, that tension between effort and you know what's required is exactly in that sweet spot where it's not too hard and not too easy. You're like a violin string that's been perfectly tuned. you
Mhm.
know and we can
And that's actually a mix of different brainwaves. So where it's like a focused perception, where you have the alertness, but you also combine it with that mindfulness, and you create this transcendent kind of zone, that the here and now, or again, flow, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, and what's great about that is it can be achieved, sort of going back to what we were saying at the beginning, is like in so many different ways, not just merely making art, but in all kinds of other fields, or whatever we're doing in our work. This can be very creative, and in something that may be associated with creativity may not be creative at all. And I think this sort of one tangent I wanted to sort of go on is the idea of creative work. Where people so often would like to do something like a creative job, like, oh, I wish that I was, I did something that was more creative. But sometimes that ends up being, like the big flashy, like the example I'm thinking of is, I read this interview with this fashion photographer, and he was on location in Rome, and it was very exotic, and the best part of his day was that he had like an hour break or a half hour break, and he got to just walk around a little bit in the city, and he had his like point and shoot camera, and he took some shoot, and then he had to go back to finish this fashion shoot, and he was just kind of burnt out on it, and he had to do it for the client. He was just, and I was like, yeah, that must suck, that you sort of wanted to have this creative job, and then it turned out to be maybe a bit cookie cutter, a little bit sort of, having to meet the expectations of a client, which could be very creative as well. But I just feel like there's people should be warned about trying to chase the creative job, and just to make sure you know exactly what the job description is going to be. Like if it's really going to be creative, or is this going to be something that's going to be so demanding, using the tools of creativity, but not in any way that makes you feel fulfilled.
Yeah, yeah, and even in creative work, I guess if you're making a movie, there's all these creativity that there will be clashes too, because you are seeing things differently than, let's say, the director or the screenwriter, and so on. So it's also a collaboration too, where you don't get your own way
Yeah.
exactly the way you want, and that's again stifling your creativity in many ways.
Yeah, and I know people who are like interested in writing,
Hmm.
maybe they take a copywriting job at
Hmm.
in marketing or
Hmm.
something, and then they're kind of miserable because maybe it's not the job that they love, and it's like, well, it's sort of writing. It's like, but it's not. And I remember somebody told me, like a creative writing teacher way back in high school, said, if someone's serious about being a writer, like just get a job that allows you to write. Like, I mean, allows you to write on your own time. So
Hmm.
something that gives you good work-life balance isn't overly demanding in terms of sucking you dry energy wise, and then go and do your creative thing. But don't mix those things up, because if you want to write a novel, being a copywriter isn't getting you any closer to that. Go drive a cab. like,
Exactly. It makes it worse probably because then you lose the enjoyment you get, the passion for it. And so like somebody like Stanley Kubrick would say, okay, you know what? Forget about it. I'm going to create my own movie production company. And so and we see that currently also with many people self-publishing, and it does take a bit of an investment, but then actually it's really the work you want to put out. Now, for better or for worse, but it's still your creative product. And with creativity, it's also like it's quite subjective because we hear these stories of these great writers who don't get published and get rejected various times, and you think, what were they thinking? They're thinking themselves, the editors, what were we thinking? We missed out on our big shot.
yeah,
And so it's something also subjective, perhaps.
yeah,
Like
and I
not
mean, I think
everybody sees creative the same way, is what I'm trying to get across.
that's right. And I think at some point you just have to decide why you're doing it. You're just sort of doing it to do it. Like there's no with without, you're talking about the sort of that beta level, or uh outcome based. Today I'm going to do these things. Well, that's not really going to serve you well for a lifetime of working in obscurity, but potentially doing something super creative and something that eventually is considered quite significant and important. You're going to need something a much freer kind of conception of what's the value in getting up day after day and trying to write something that maybe only a handful of people will ever read. So, but somehow you enjoy floating in that space of creativity, of invention, of creating characters and dialogue and so on.
Well,
And then even people who do get recognition. I mean, I've read so many interviews with writers where it's sort of like they say, like, if you're writing because you want to get published, and these are published writers, like, know that high that goes along with being published lasts a couple of weeks, a few months, like, and then you're just back to getting up in the morning and facing a blank page, like it doesn't change, just because you have, and it might even get even more stressful after you.
exactly. Exactly. It gets worse because then once you have success, then you want to live up to it and you feel more pressured, and then it becomes a vicious cycle. And again, you enjoy it less and less, as you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, there's an expectation suddenly that where it's like, oh, I wish that I was working my first novel again, where nobody cared what I did and I was free to do whatever I wanted to. So it really kind of that the pleasures of creativity has to come down to something very basic in terms of it's you getting up and just being creative without any expectation, without any thought of anything beyond that.
And I think that's why we see the rise of podcasting too, because there is like, this is a creative expression, and I don't, there is no outcome here. It's like, yeah, we to have people listen in, and maybe not, they're not, but we're still doing it, so that kind of drive, because it gives us pleasure. And I think that's hugely important. And but when we look back to flow, what's quite interesting in that state is that we basically, and athletes go through it as well, on like basketball courts and on the ice and hockey and so on. And they are talking about a state that does not include the ego. It's basically kind of like transcending that part. And I find that quite fascinating because it's like, it seems that again, it's a completely different zone where you're at your best when the ego does not get in the way of commenting on things, of criticizing you, of blocking you. You just go with that flow, and that's when you're at your peak performance.
Yeah, absolutely. And then even though it's sort of, you get into that state and you're in that egoless state where you're at your best, and then it's possible that 30 seconds after you're done, the ego will come flying back in and go, "Wow, that was super great." But that's just we can't sort of get away from that necessarily. But that's just the way. And then later, maybe that ego does get in the way, next time, because, oh my God, I'm so super great, and then there's that interference, and it might even become more difficult to get back into that flow state.
But in terms of writing or creating content, I think that's quite useful to tap into it and then have the ego and come and take a look at it and see, oh, this is what I've created in that state. So that's like things where you just free writing, where you write anything that comes to your mind, and often it's not very good, right? And that's okay. But then there's like one like interesting thought. It's like, oh, I let my creativity flow, and there are these like moments where you say, oh, this is something that I could develop, this is something that could become something much bigger that I hadn't thought of.
Yeah. Just to shift a little bit, one of the things that I find interesting in terms of how creativity is perceived, there's a kind of a positive side to this and a cynical side to this. Steve Jobs had a quote, which is, creativity is just connecting things. And, sort of almost minimizing what it is. And then I forget who it is that originally said, you know, amateur artists borrow, real artists steal. And and then I have one more here from Einstein. The secret to creativity is knowing how to hide your sources. So and it's maybe to some extent that idea that sort of nothing is really new, everything is a kind of a reconstitution or a remix, but it's the creativity comes from combining things in new ways, and some of that is what we would really feel truly creative, and some of that is you just know like two more things than your audience. Sometimes like when as you get older and you hear somebody covering some song from the 90s, and they're like, this is such a great song. It's like, yeah, but it's not, that was created by someone entirely different, and they there's a lot of just sort of, sometimes as you get to know some about a particular kind of art, like be it like digital art and Photoshop or something like that, you go, oh, actually that's not that hard to do. They just know how to do this thing and they combine it with other thing. Oh, okay. So is it a kind of smoke and mirrors sometimes, but
Yeah.
but no less creative.
No, I mean, this is really like odd, but what comes to mind is Under Pressure, that became Vanilla
Right.
Ice's famous song. And I think actually, even though in terms of talent, like, you have David Bowie and Queen, who are much more talented, I think the Vanilla Ice one is actually better because he's taking it and he's taking it into rap territory, which is, again, quite unheard of, and that kind of
Yeah.
thing. But going back to Einstein, I mean, his wife was very, or ex-wife was very influential in a lot of his theories, and I find it interesting that I didn't know that quote, but it's like purposely kind of cutting her out of the deal and just taking all the credit. And that kind of made me think that a lot of the people that we consider geniuses are again borrowing from others or stealing as well and not giving them credit. And we see that with various like people we admire, and I think that's a lack of honesty there too, because they're afraid of being seen as less if they reveal their sources and say, well, guess what? This baker just gave me an idea today, and that's why I came up with my great theory. And we want to not show those sources to get more
I
credit.
guess, there's a kind of, what's the word about it? Like, there's sort of, when I talk about that sort of real artist, amateur artist, like there's a kind of a modesty that goes along with the amateur artist, and there's a kind of what's the word for it? Like complete, you want to make this work, you want to make this work, and you're going to do it at any cost. You're just sort of relentless, and you're like, here's what I'm doing, and I'm not going to explain how I did it. I'm not going to give anything away. I'm not going to sort of belittle myself in any way, and I'm going to be sort of the consummate performer who or consummate magician who doesn't give away the tricks. And I don't know. I think part of it is I know the writer Chuck Palahniuk, who did Fight Club. I like it. I like his work. I don't like everything, but some of it I think is great. And I've heard him say about his work that he sometimes feels less of a writer and more of a kind of journalist, in the sense of cobbling together things, and so like within Fight Club, a lot of the really outrageous bits and pieces are actually just based on anecdotes and things that he heard, like rendering soap from human fat, things like that. Those were just things that he heard about. It didn't just come out of his imagination. So he sort of minimized it, but in the same time, that's a fact that's available to a lot of people. He's the one who's able to put it together into
Yes,
this
yes,
amazing
that's it. Yeah,
novel.
give it a unique spin, right? And I saw an interview with Sting many years ago where he says, well, in terms of music, everybody is stealing from the other person. I mean, you have Bach, and then you have Mozart stealing from him, and Beethoven stealing from them, and it's kind of like it's acknowledged, and people know it. And so as somebody who comes from the teaching profession, and we think of plagiarism, for them it's seen as perfectly normal, and you're taking the other person's work and you are basically improving on it or commenting on it and so on. And we had that with the previous notion in medieval times, where they would take a book, but they would not just transcribe it, but add their own bits to it and completely changing the original work, and which was seen as fine back then.
Right. There was no authorship. There was no
Exactly.
author. There was just this floating text that was just sort of being redacted and added onto.
Kind of like Wikipedia, I guess.
That's right. Now we're back. We're back to that. Just something that I kind of wanted to get back to so that we don't lose it. When you were talking about, those levels of consciousness, those brainwaves and all that, and where creativity comes from, one of the things I find really interesting is the gradual moving away from the idea of left and right brain. That we used to have this very strict kind of right brain was associated with creativity, left brain was more the analytical side.
I think that's more seen as a myth now with like
that's what I'm saying. It's completely.
And so I'm angry because like all these years I was taught this, and now I say, no, guess what? It wasn't true. And so that happens with science, where it's like,
I know, but it always seemed like I was very suspicious about it, because it just struck me that in any kind of endeavor, you're going to need a bit of both. Like there's no, you don't create art without some analytical skill. It's not just complete chaos and pure expression of emotion, or so music is extremely mathematical. So like if you're a musician, you're definitely drawing on a very sort of analytical left brain type of activity, and yet of course you also need to have all of those creative things. And so I was just watching something before this today, and there was apparently now they've identified over 40 parts of the brain that are associated with creativity, and they're scattered across the brain. They're not concentrated in the left or the right. And then when you have artists who have some suffer any kind of brain damage, then just like the neuroplasticity of the brain, other parts of the brain take over. So there's really that whole left right brain thing is out the window. And I love the idea that creativity cannot be so easily reduced down to like, oh, left brain, right brain,
yeah. It goes down to, it's not just about knowledge, like what Einstein was saying. It's the connection that you see, the connectivity between the parts. It's not just, okay, this is all the things I know, and that's become outdated. That kind of idea is like, oh, I have knowledge, and we say yes, but what are you going to do with that knowledge, moving into the territory of wisdom?
Yeah, and I think moving also, I think with knowledge, as we grow a body of knowledge, we become very focused on, what is correct and what is wrong, and a very kind of pass-fail sort of approach to experience. Whereas creativity, I think, doesn't happen without experimentation and just being completely embracing failure. Just that, just constantly, the Beckett quote about, try again, fail better. Like just and it's sort of a kind of attitude that doesn't always mesh with corporate success, let's say. Like, you're given a deadline and saying, well, we tried and we failed, 20 times, but things are getting really interesting is probably not something that most, CEOs want to hear, but it's actually the way that really amazing things are come about.
Yeah, exactly. And that stops growth because if you're not taking, and I actually put down risk taking related to creativity because I think that is, yeah, you're out on a limb and you're just trying to figure out things and you will get it wrong, of course. But that's the whole benefit of it. But again, as you're saying, people are afraid of that, whether it's in terms of losing money or in terms of losing like prestige and people don't talk about it. And that's again, they're not only hiding their sources, they're also hiding the failures. And we think it's coming naturally to them, but we don't see the amount of work and effort it took to get to that point. There
Yeah,
is
I
no
mean,
overnight success. I was
that's
watching
right.
the Beatles documentary, Ron Howard one, about them touring, and they were like, they were working hard, and they were actually at a point of like almost giving up. They're like, this is not working out. They were in this like hotel room that didn't have a washroom, and they're like, you know what, let's just give up. And it's kind of like amazing that they still continued, and amazing of with retrospect, with hindsight, this was such a crucial moment, but they didn't give up. They
Mhm.
went on. And why did they go on? It's probably intuition. It's probably that part. It's like, no, keep going. Don't give up. Don't stop now. Right?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, that definitely there had to be that commitment. But I also think a quote I really like from Elizabeth Gilbert is about, what is a creative life? And
Mhm.
she says that creative life is one that is driven more by curiosity than fear. And I think that one is a really big one because sometimes when I sort of think, well, what is creativity? What's another word for creativity, or what's prime, maybe one of the prime drivers for it? And I think curiosity is a really
I
good
like that.
neighbor to it, sort
Hmm.
of adjacent, sort of where you don't really have, and curiosity, you can't really be afraid and curious in the same time. I don't think, or one would be have to be kind of dimmed, and I think with curiosity you can, it's not saying good or bad, you're just like, just want to know what's going to
Yeah.
happen next, and I think sometimes when people are interested in an idea, they're not saying it's, oh, this is the idea that's going to take me to over the top. It's just, I'm just curious, I just wonder what this is, I just want to stay with it long enough to see where
Yeah.
it goes
Yeah.
without any judgment about it. And I think that one, that curiosity is sort of ground zero for creativity. And I know if
Hmm.
I'm super blocked in anything I'm doing creatively, I'm like, okay, stop thinking about how terrible it is or how great it might
Hmm.
be. What about this idea just interests me? Like, what is it that I'm curious about? And if the answer is nothing, then it's time to put it away and do
Hmm.
something
Hmm.
else, and wait for something that you are curious about.
I want to look at the downside of creativity because we all talk about the good things. And I really like what you mentioned here because curiosity and fear cannot coexist. I completely agree with that. But creativity and fear can. And this can make it difficult because what you do is you are creative in your fears, you are creative in your criticisms of yourself. So it can also backfire in terms of anxiety too. And I think people who are creative do suffer from it, perhaps for a reason, because they are being creative with their fears.
They're creative with their fears. So unpack this a bit more. How do you mean?
So it's because you have a creative mindset, and you probably also have more sensitivity because
Ah,
and that would could lead it in being again um, not necessarily realistic with things. And we see it also in terms of media where there are quite creative, I must say, in terms of creativity. There are some theories and these conspiracy theories that are incredibly creative, but they're completely outlandish as well. So that is to me the negative side, where it's not balanced with reason, or we are magnifying the darker parts within ourselves.
yeah, I see. I see too. Yeah, I know. Like when I think about like doing really super heavy psychedelic drugs like ayahuasca, one
Hmm.
of the things that holds me back is I know how good my own mind is at
There you
torturing.
go. That's it. Hmm.
And when people say that they're presented with all kinds of horrific images in their minds, I'm like, oh, that's definitely going to be my trip. Like I'm definitely my mind knows best what will freak me out, and it's pretty good at creating those images. And I just wouldn't want to go there. And I yeah, and I agree that sometimes having a very sort of overactive imagination
Hmm.
is
Yeah.
always doesn't always make
Yeah.
for
But
very
it can be channeled. It can be, and that's why I mean the amazing paintings that we admire, we say, "Oh, this is beautiful." It's like, no, this was my state of mind. This is how what I was seeing and what I was feeling, and so even somebody like Picasso, and you look at it and you look at the work, and there's a lot of like negative side that is coming out. It's kind of using it, using the canvas to paint your fears, and whether it's also in movie making, where the ones who are most outlandish, we say we celebrate them, and they could have been serial killers in if things circumstances had been different when it comes to them.
Yeah, I mean, this on one hand, sort of these images are very horrific, but on the other hand, it's a way of making friends with those
Hmm.
impulses
Yes.
and sort of befriending death and all kinds of fears and
Hmm.
and taming them by sort of casting them in our own inventions, our own creations, as opposed to
And
being
transcending them in that way, because you are liberating yourself from these things, from these impulses, but in a productive way, in a beneficial way, because others can benefit from it as well, instead of creating havoc and destruction.
yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
Um, and now just to go kind of another way, which is this is
We're being
imagination.
very creative here. This is the most creative
That's
session we've
right.
had, which is perfect. Just keep going. I'm not
But
stopping
the
you.
other one that I wanted to touch on also was the idea that we sort of think of, oh, some people are creative, some people aren't, um,
No, good
but
point.
or maybe creativity is something that gets developed in some. But then there's also this idea that creativity is our natural state, and it's just being civilized and being shut into a 40-hour work week, sort of strips that from us, but that in our most natural state we are all creative.
I somewhat agree with that, but I think it's like we have more control over it than we think. And I think the danger for me, the opposite of creativity, is kind of blind conformity. And we see that, and where people just like, okay, this is what you're saying, and I'm going to blindly follow you. And I think these people, I don't think I think they might have creativity, but they are afraid of using it. And I think that's when fear and creativity can work together, but then the fear would be stronger, and you won't develop that creative side, that unique way of seeing things, and you're just too afraid of speaking up, for example,
That's
and you
right.
go with the norm. I think that's the danger, and it's understandable, but it's also it's the comfort zone. It's also laziness. It's also, I don't have to think of a new way of doing things because, well, it's already established, so I can just take it easy.
Yeah, I'm just looking at a quote from Picasso. Every
Hmm.
child is an artist. The problem is staying an artist when you grow up.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I find it quite interesting, because something that children have, and imagination, of course, but they also have this way of magical thinking, where they believe in things that don't exist, and we lose that because of our, again, like you're saying, of our upbringing, civilization, education. But I think it's hugely important for creativity to keep that part of ourselves alive, and not only for that, but also for seeing things differently and being able to tap into that, instead of just having like one way of doing things. And that's what's actually being promoted throughout the world, which is terrifying, of just having one point of view without being able to see things from different perspectives.
Yes, yeah, I agree. And also, I think trusting that,
Hmm.
we
Yeah.
are our best source for that,
Yes.
or that
Yes.
we could be a source for that because we get so kind of deadened and numbed by, all of the everything on our phones and social
Yeah.
media and
Yeah.
all of these often very commercialized creative, commercialized creativity where it's sort of, it's not creative unless it's some movie that has, you know, special effects, or it's some
Great
really
point.
fancy like Instagram post. And we're like, well, I don't do that, you know, like I outsourced all my creativity to the world, and I don't produce any creativity myself anymore because I don't
It,
do that. And it's like that, but that's, I think, you know, that's sad when people sort of give up
yes,
on
yes.
themselves.
Yes, it's very sad. And when we look at our DNA and the way we look and the way we think and the way our experiences, we're unique in the world. So that means if we share our own perspective, unfiltered from all the other stuff, we will come up with a unique voice. And we see that those are the artists we like the best. They have their own style, or they, in terms of music, in terms of filmmaking, in terms of writing, in terms of painting, because they tapped into their that unique potential that's there and really like went that path. Whereas others who just copying it, they're replaceable, right?
That's right. Sorry, I'm just looking at the. I'm just seeing the rest of the Steve Jobs quote that I had earlier about
Okay.
creativity just connecting things.
Mhm.
And so the rest of it is, when you ask creative people how they did something, they feel a little guilty because they didn't really do it. They just saw something. It seemed obvious to them after a while. So it's sort of a little less cynical than at first it seemed. That again, that sort of sense that creative people have this receptivity about them,
Yeah.
and can kind of are, you know, sort of passive recipients to it, and then they bring it to us. They know how to package it, they know how to do the work, but ultimately there's something just about being open to this creativity. And that's again the same idea that if given up on yourself as a possible receiver, then you're just never going to hear that voice, or have that, which we are all capable of at least a little bit. And you know, and I you know, people talk about, you know, they're creative in their cooking or whatever, and I think that's totally valid, you know. And maybe my younger self would have been a little bit like, that's not creativity, but I see it now, especially when it's something that people do kind of for others, you know, like when they find some way of bringing value to other people's lives in a new and surprising way.
But it's also unique because that pie, you know, that this person makes is different from all the other pies you've had, you know. So it's that in terms of cooking again, that it's
Yeah.
that, and we can expand it to anything. That we can expand it to teaching. We could expand it to a medical doctor and so on, a psychiatrist. It's just their unique way of doing things that is the creative expression. And to go back again, being receptive, I think yes, hugely important. I've been open to various ways of thinking in terms of psychology and psychiatry and so on, but there are certain parts that I like, and also religions too. There's certain parts that I like, and then certain parts I don't. And it seems like heresy to say, oh no, I don't accept the full package. But what I've created for myself that I'm again want to share with other people is a unique way of putting all of those things together, the best parts, and being able to help others and to reach healing, to reach a connection with your true self, which has worked for me, and which is again, I'm the experiment. And so I instead of just falling into saying psychoanalysis is wonderful, let's all do it. Yes, but it has its limitations. And it again, when I say that, people say, well, what are you talking about? No, it's perfect. And no, it's not. And that, I think that's where creativity could also really help build on something that's already good to make it even better.
And then sort of following on that, I think there's creativity sometimes in merely making a space that is amenable to creativity. You know, like as teachers, you know, we both taught that English 99 course where people would do a couple of weeks on a different disciplines, and there was one about English literature where they had to kind of try to understand metaphor and things like that. And a lot of students were, oh, I don't do literature. Like I can't, my mind doesn't work that way. And the challenge for us was to create a kind of space where people would feel kind of relaxed enough, or be able to sort of allow themselves to be in a more creative state. And I think that in itself is an act of creativity. And I got a quote here from Einstein again:
Mhm.
creativity is contagious, pass it
Oh,
on. And
yes.
I think that is something where when you're around creative people, it can be very intimidating on one hand, if they're awesome works, and it's like, oh, I could never do that. But then it could also, if you let yourself, I think, sort of go, oh, wait a minute, that's just a human being being creative. That's another mode of being that is probably accessible to me on some level. So, you
And
know,
at some point it's cooperation, but in other points it's like conflict and competition. And I think the best example, again, to do another example we talked about earlier, would be the Beatles with Lennon and McCartney, because they were at their best when they were together, when they were fighting with each other, they were coming up with things. But then when they separated in their solo careers, and we see that often, it just it was good, right? But it's not the same. That's missing that spark. And like you're saying, yes, creativity is absolutely contagious, and it might awaken creativity within us, or we might want to do better with them. And I remember when I watched great films and just like inspired, and or read great books, and it's like I want to do something, whether it's the same format or not, but I want to do something creative because that awoke something within, moved me, resonated with me in different ways.
yeah, and I think it's also how we choose to experience something. So maybe we look at a piece of art and we feel a lot of envy, and we feel like, oh, I could never do that.
Yeah.
But or you could feel inspired and say, oh, that makes me realize that's that's a possibility. Like, that's something that can be done, and it's the same experience. We just sort of shift our reaction to it.
And I think it goes back to again the geniuses where we think it came easy to them. It's like it didn't take any effort. They were inspired, or they just because they're brilliant. And we don't see if they were open enough to talk about their struggles. And I just love watching biographies about them, and somebody like Picasso too, where they talk about the whole process. I have so much more admiration for them, but at the same time I see, wait, it's possible, not to that level perhaps, again we want to be realistic, but it's possible if we do the work, and that kind of the growth mindset of no, you're not born a genius necessarily, or if you are born, good for you, but you still have to develop the craft. It's not like automatic.
That's right. I really like Louis C.K.'s story where he went like a decade without
Mm-hmm.
really any, I think he was living in his car at some point,
Mm-hmm.
and he hated his own material. Like, the work that he, like,
Mm-hmm.
just his whole approach to it was, he was a very sort of very basic, observational comedian, and it was very, very light, and he would do corporate gigs, and he was just always coming away going, I suck. And then it was sort of the day that he sort of started talking about how miserable he was. He sort of just took that chance and just got really kind of raw and real about how bad his life was. And then that was sort of the turning point. But then everybody was like, oh, an overnight success. We've never heard of
Yeah,
you. And it's like, yeah, 10 years to be an
yeah,
overnight success.
yeah.
Um, and so it is important for us, I think, to know that, some great art, whatever, always looks easier than it,
Yes,
it's supposed to
yes.
look easy, right? Like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, and but at the same time, yeah, we can be inspired by the fact that, well, they suck too at one point. That's where we all have to start there.
Or even when you had George Harrison, who made when he was on his own, and he had like comeback album, and it's like coming back. I've always been here. It's just like now you're noticing me, and that kind of level. It's like it's continuous, and it's sometimes hard to also know if our stuff is good enough, and we have misperceptions. We might think it's brilliant when it's not, or the opposite, it's actually very good, but we're so critical of ourselves that we don't see it that way, and we have to
Yeah.
keep that in mind. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the biggest lessons is how contextual the value of any sort of creative endeavor can be.
Mhm.
Whereas, an image, photograph in one context can be seen as like a huge accomplishment, and quite, quite progressive, and oh, this is great. And then in somewhere else, it just completely falls flat and has no, just doesn't have any currency, and even over time, things kind of taste change, and how we perceive a work of art changes.
Hmm.
And it's almost, like, does it have any intrinsic value? Probably not. It's only got the value that's kind of based on a kind of, you know, of the moment, or, a relationship that you have with others and with that piece. And I think the successful artist can just roll with that,
Yeah.
and the one that doesn't get stuck on some early
Mhm,
success
mhm.
or something, and then, the next thing they do doesn't receive the same kind of accolades, and then it's like they just sit there going, you never my early stuff is so great, you don't get it, or whatever.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
And it's just, you got to just constantly reinvent yourself, got to constantly let go of whatever was yesterday's big ego thrill, and you just back down to ground zero, where you're just trying something.
I just think of like when Beethoven finished his Third Symphony and the Eroica, and he was disappointed with Napoleon. He was celebrating him, and he almost like I think he was thinking of destroying it, and he said, "No, I'm just gonna change the title." And I think that's brilliant, and I think we need to hold on to stuff when creative people are destroying the previous work. I say, don't do it, or anybody, give it a shot. It might be good or it might not be good. It doesn't matter either way, but give it a shot and throw it out there and let other people decide too. And we might think it's great, but they disagree, or the other way around as well, as we were saying. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, risk taking is
Hmm.
has been creativity, will probably pay off in some way. Like, it's probably, and the stakes are never quite as high as we think they are.
Exactly.
Like,
Exactly.
it's not great. Nobody's gonna die here if you get ridiculed for your art a little bit.
Yeah.
And yeah, you don't
There's
know.
always the chance of a comeback. And I see it with like let's say filmmakers too, where they have great film but they never live up to it. I'm just waiting. It's like, okay, maybe the next one, and that's kind of interesting too. It's like you have that hope. It's like they will get back on track to their previous like stardom and glory, or they don't. Either way, it's fine as long as they're happy with what they're doing too. We don't have to be happy there, the artists themselves, like, I'm happy with this. I lose a lot of money, who cares, but I enjoyed it. And I think that's also very important. That counts as well. Whether it's good or not is a different issue in many cases too.
Yeah, I always give people marks for the
For
attempt.
trying.
Yeah, you get
For
like a,
trying to be creative. Yeah.
yeah, as opposed to just doing the same thing. And even with myself, I'll say, well, that wasn't that great, but hey, that's really awesome that you set aside an afternoon to try that. And who knows if that's gonna not lead to the success? Like, you're not gonna get anywhere if you're not
Yeah.
taking those leaps and those risks.
And the worst thing is when you are as in terms of teaching, when you get this like awesome creative essay that has nothing to do with what they're supposed to do, and I feel kind of bad. It's like, okay, there were some points for creativity, but you still fail, right? But it's also seeing that, and again, your creativity, maybe you need to apply to something else. Maybe it's not in that field, or they don't acknowledge it or appreciate it enough. So to keep that, to be creative about that as well.
Yeah, and you're not going to find out unless you do kind of flail a little
Exactly.
bit and just keep
Yeah.
keep trying stuff wherever you are.
Okay, so
Well,
we're almost out of time, and this
yes,
was the wildest one we've had. I think the most creative one, which is
which was
perfect and
appropriate.
exactly appropriate. And yeah, thank you so much for engaging with me in this discussion and creativity. And hope to have comments from people, or even suggestions for if there are any specific topic you would like us to talk about. Because again, we're trying to be as creative as possible, but then maybe others have also great ideas and would love to do that too.
All right. Have a good day,
Thank you very
everyone.
much,
Thank you
and
very much.
we will see each other soon. Take
That's
care.
right.